As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm here with Peter Huntsman. He is the president and CEO of Huntsman Corporation. Peter, thanks so much for being with us.
Dan, pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And you run an amazing company, and you're also deeply involved in philanthropy and the mental health side, cancer research. The Huntsman family has long been big advocates of these things, and so we certainly appreciate that.
Well, we have over 10,000 associates around the world that allow us to have a great company and do something good with our earnings. So, yes.
So I appreciate you being here today because we want to talk about how coronavirus is affecting industries, maybe some good business advice for a lot of struggling companies or business owners that might be listening. And also want to get your take on what you do at Huntsman, which is chemical production, plastics, and how that ties into our Texas oil and gas industry and how that ties into everything that everybody needs right now with respect to plastics. I think there's a lot of interesting things to dive into. So I guess I'll start. How many people work at Huntsman?
We have about 10,000 people working at Huntsman. We have about 1,000 people just in the North Houston area between Conroe, Texas, Cut and Shoot, and the Woodlands area. Our employees are all throughout Houston area. And
we were just talking before this, you guys are a very necessary business, so operations are still ongoing. People still have jobs. That's the good news, right? That's
right. We're considered an essential company, and we have publicly announced, given the future that we can see right now, we've got no layoffs, we've got no furloughs that we're planning, and we have a hiring freeze in place. But other than that, it's business as usual, and we're keeping things moving.
Good to hear. Good to hear. Okay, I have a question. How do you make plastic?
Well, it's a good question. It's a one that, and when we talk about plastics, most people think of plastics as a plastic bag, something that we don't produce. We don't produce the raw materials for that. But when you think about plastics, think about a product that starts with natural gas liquids, ethane, propane, butane. When you punch a hole in the ground, you're either getting liquid out, which traditionally is considered to be crude oil, or you're getting gas out. And you can use either one of those. The United States, just to give you an example, 13 years ago, so our company spends about $400 million a year in investing and expanding our company. And as you look at we have a big chunk of that's discretionary capital. Where do we want to invest it? 90% of that was invested outside the United States 13, 14 years ago. Today, 90% of that is invested in the United States.
Really?
So that's what fracking has done. In about a year or two basis, we went from being one of the most expensive raw material producers, so I'm still at the gas and oil, level, and to being the most competitive. We now can compete with the Middle East. We can compete with countries that subsidize their oil and gas industry like Russia and China and so forth. So you start with oil and gas, you process those, you get into basic plastics. That would be a plastic bag.
How many people do you think realize that plastic comes from oil and gas? Have you ever polled the American people on this?
No, I haven't. It would be an interesting poll. I do have the opportunity. I tried to get it and speak to in business settings around universities and so forth. And I'm always astounded when people will come up to me and say, I'm boycotting the plastics, the chemical, the energy industry. And they're sitting there on their laptop computers, which wouldn't exist without plastic.
Right.
Medical devices, any medical device would not exist without plastic.
Yeah, the anger from the environmentalist, remember the radical environmentalist against plastics it's strange to me. I can see some of the single-use plastic frustrations, I guess. That makes sense. But the widespread hatred of it, and I think the lack of knowledge about the fact that so many things are made from some kind of plastic, whether it's synthetics in your clothing or anything else. I mean, if you started to take things away that were made from a fossil fuel base, just in any given room, the entire room would start to disappear. And I don't know if people realize that.
Paints, carpets, furniture, sound systems, electricity, lighting, generation of power. Think of a Boeing 787. I'm just talking about our customers.
Yeah.
A Boeing 787 jetliner has 21 tons of Huntsman material per plane. So we don't make the seats. We don't the entire wing structure, the body, the fuselage. And those planes today virtually don't contain any aluminum or metal alloys. It's plastics basically. It's lighter, flies further. It's more fuel efficient. It's more environmentally friendly in the production of it.
Right.
So yes, I mean, when you think about plastics, it's certainly something more than just a plastic bag.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. And what would you say the best way is then to, I guess, how do you have those conversations when you guys are criticized as a big corporation that just makes plastics? But I mean, we should be pointing out some of the benefits too, and especially nowadays with coronavirus happening, and one of our biggest issues is producing things that almost are entirely made of plastic, whether it's testing kits, whether it's ventilators, or whether it's PPE. All of these things, where do they come from?
Well, a lot of it, fortunately and unfortunately, I guess, and depending on which side of the argument on, this is based on pure science. It takes so many atoms and molecules to make a component of plastic. And I'm not a scientist. I'm not even a college graduate, so I'm not trying to sound technical here. But if you look at the recent case of San Francisco, they recently banned plastic a few years ago. And with the coronavirus, they now have banned cotton reusable bags. So you cannot use a cotton reusable grocery sack. You can't take that. You cannot use that in San Francisco.
Why can't we use that?
In San Francisco, because it's considered to be too contaminated.
For coronavirus reasons.
Coronavirus reasons. So now we're going back to where you have to use disposable plastic bags in San Francisco. And I assume when this is all behind us, they'll probably shift back. But just to give you an idea, if you have a cotton bag, and this isn't Huntsman Corporation, this isn't the chemical industry speaking, cotton bags, to have one of those is equivalent. You have to use roughly 20,000 plastic bags to have the same environmental impact or footprint.
Right.
Is one cotton bag.
And that's because of the production, right?
Production, cleaning it. Every time you clean it, you're using energy, you're using oil, you're using gas, unless you never clean it, in which case
so if you never clean it, but it's still probably multitudes bigger. Maybe I should clean those bags. They make us feel good. This is always the question, right? Are we feeling good or are we doing good? I've heard that statistic before. It's not the first time I've heard it, and it's kind of shocking at first. I don't know what I always point out with the plastic straw obsession is this. Like the problem isn't that you're using a plastic straw. The problem is if it gets in the ocean. So maybe we should stop it from getting in the ocean. And is it really America that is throwing plastic straws in the ocean? And the answer is, of course, no. There's like 5 rivers
that make up about 80% of the refuge in the ocean, and
not American rivers.
5 of the 7 rivers flow through China.
Right.
So.
Another reason we should be mad at China these days.
Well, you're on an anti-China kick,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, we're going to get to that in a minute because we want to hear your global business, and we want to hear some smart ways to be confronting our adversary across the Pacific Ocean. But first, let's stick to the plastic stuff for a little bit. So I wonder, how can you put it into terms for people how much better our hygiene is as just modern Americans or modern citizens of the world with plastic? Think about a time when you didn't have plastic. I mean, I'm not sure people realize that as they bash these kind of things.
Well, think of just when you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth with the plastic. Think before, your grandparents probably had glass shampoo in the shower that regularly fell and shattered. We've got everything now, of course, is plastic. Yeah. Plastic packaging. Think of the toothpaste, which now is being liberally dispensed at a much lower cost. And all this stuff goes back to cost. We didn't move to plastic as a society because it was more expensive or because it wasn't environmentally friendly. We went there because it was cheap, it was effective, it made sense from a sanitation point of view. It's totally recyclable. Yeah. And it's incredibly inexpensive to produce. And now today it's an American homegrown material product that employs millions of people across the U.S.
Let's talk about the recyclable part. You guys do some pretty cool things with recycled bottles. You actually make insulation from those bottles, right?
Yeah. So you think of when you go in the attic, you've got that. I'm being very biased. So you've got that cheap pink stuff, that fiberglass stuff that you roll out, or you can use polyurethane spray foam.
Okay.
And insulation. All insulations are great because they allow us to insulate, keep warm, or keep cool a house without burning more energy, essentially. But a very preferred insulation, at least in my opinion, because we make it, is polyurethane, the spray foam. In order to do that, you have to put two chemicals together, an MDI and a polyol. Polyols are made out of polyester, and we have a proprietary technology that allows us to take 1 billion bottles a year, the equivalency of 1 billion bottles of used post-consumer PET bottles, recycle those, and use that as a raw material. So we're taking the PET or the water bottles, soda bottles, and so forth used out of landfills, recycling bins, and so forth. You grind that up, use it as a raw material to make an insulation that is used for 30, 40 years in a home to conserve CO2. It seems like a wonderful life cycle.
So that's really cool, and that's a story that I think people should hear a lot more of. And where do you get all these bottles?
From recyclers. When somebody goes in, either when you're throwing it away in the recycling bin or you're throwing it, hopefully not throwing it away in the ocean. Yeah,
well, that is the hope. I mean, we don't have a great, I've lived in California, I've lived in Texas. I know that there's quite a vast difference in the recycling infrastructure. So do you have to import these bottles here?
Yes, in this area we do. Yeah. So we don't import the actual bottles, and you put one of those into a recycling place. They take the bottles, they separate out from the garbage, and then they grind it up into little chunks. So it's much easier, much cheaper to transport. So we get it in those little pellet forms after it's been ground up. We don't actually take 1 billion bottles into our plant and grind them up, but that's what the recyclers do.
Got it. And you buy that and you make this insulation. I mean, you can't imagine a more green process, really. Like you're saving energy with a better insulation, plus you're recycling plastic. Are there a lot of other industries that do anything similar to that, or is this unique? And can we grow this sort of environmentalism alongside our industry?
I think that you'd be surprised. I'd like to think that Huntsman's on the cutting edge of this, but if you talk to Dow Chemical, if you talk to some of our competitors in Germany and so forth, I think most of them would have some pretty unique and surprising applications. Yeah. And look, we're not people that sit in an ivory tower just trying to exploit how to make money all day. Right. This is what the consumer wants. This is where society's going.
Oh, 100%. You're more likely to buy something if you hear that it's made from recycled plastic. I think a lot of us want to feel good about what we're purchasing.
We do. And so, this is smart business. The whole environmental movement. When I was a kid, my dad worked in the Nixon administration. I remember driving along the Potomac River, going down the White House to see him over the weekends. You drive by the Potomac River and there are dead fish in it, and it was horrible.
Back in the day, not
back
anymore.
In the day. I mean, Nixon,
we've gotten so much cleaner.
We have
in the decades. Yeah.
Every aspect of our GDP, the energy we produce, every aspect of steel, chemicals, everything we produce today, we do it cleaner. A car in the 1970s, standing still, leaked more product and emitted more product than a car today driving down the freeway. Think about that.
That's crazy.
I mean, remember the car in the 70s? You probably wouldn't, but in the car in the 70s, you pull it away.
I wasn't alive.
But every time you pull a car away, there's a big oil pool, and there's a gasoline pool sitting there.
I don't know if this is your area of expertise, but there is kind of a debate surrounding recycling and how useful it really is for the environment, how much energy it expends versus the utility that we derive from it. What's your general? I don't really know. What's your general take on it?
And I know this isn't the popular answer. It's an economic and an environmental disaster.
Oh, well, I don't know what the popular answer is, to be honest.
But I mean,
I just want the truth.
People want to think that I'm putting all this effort into separating out my garbage and everything.
Right.
If we had and yes, we do have a limited supply, but I think you go back 20, 30, 40 years on virtually any prediction that's made on any ores, raw materials, and so forth. And yes, we do have finite production of all these, but recycling, the amount of energy just taken to bring everything together into one center and then redistribute it. Melt it and everything takes far more energy than it does to produce original. Aluminum is probably your closest. When you take a can, an aluminum can, and recycle that, it's
efficient.
It's right up there and competing.
Because the problem with plastic, like people just throw a bottle in there. I've talked to some other kind of plastic experts. I don't know why I'm always around plastic experts, but what they tell me is like, listen, your plastic Coke bottle is a very different plastic from the cap. which is even different from like the little other screwy thing on it, which means
different from the label, which is different from
right. And if you don't separate these things out, and who's going to separate it out? Are you separating it out when you put it in the can? Like, no, you're not. Even in California, where they have all these separate recycling cans, it's still not separate enough. And so, what I hear from people sometimes is, I mean, the amount of labor and effort and energy used to actually get this right. And then what do you do with, you have some recycled plastic, and then, so what is the environmental benefit? I mean, these are good questions to be asking, and I'm curious.
No, they are. And that's why when you think of you just take an average plastic bag of vegetables, that bag of vegetables will typically have 5 layers of plastic, different layers. You have one that will keep oxygen out. You have another that you can print on and keep the ink on it. You have another it's a strength barrier.
Yeah.
And so you put all these barriers together, and they're all different grades of plastic. So the biggest problem with recycled plastics today, aside from the cost that you take in the CO2 and gathering and all, is what do you do with it once you have it? And so you oftentimes will see recycled plastic applications, things like go into a parking lot, the bumper, those they'll be made of plastic. Park benches will be made of this ugly grayish color plastic.
Yeah.
And so when you can get an application, a real application that goes into something like home insulation,
right?
Or
then it makes a little bit more sense.
And a number of people have just started coming up with this polyethylene where you can actually make clothing.
Okay.
I've actually touched and felt the clothing. It's tough to differentiate clothing. Now you're starting to get into consumer. If you're buying a sports shirt or something and it's made out of plastic bags, in your mind you're probably thinking it's going to be very fibrous. I'm going to feel like I'm wearing something really coarse. Well, what if you get it down to where it's you can't tell the difference in cotton?
Right.
Those are the sort of applications industry and technology are working on right now that are going to make, I think, a world of difference.
Well, okay, so what does that future look like then? Because you're saying it's kind of a waste now, unless there's a solid product like insulation or like these new sports shirts. Does that make it worth it then to actually recycle these plastics, at least from a
frankly, Dan, with crude at $25 a barrel today and gas at less than $2 per MMBTU, not really.
Yeah,
I mean,
the environmental benefit still isn't there. Maybe the marketing benefit is because people want to buy something recycled. But,
that's right.
But just if we're just looking at the data, there's and again, this is why I brought this up, because I hear this debate going on where's the actual environmental benefit to recycling?
If it made economic sense, you would see recycling bins. It would be a massive. It wouldn't be.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what. If it made economic sense, the government wouldn't be mandating that you do it. Okay, there's the simplest thing I can think of.
Yeah, but it definitely doesn't make economic sense. No. That goes without saying. I don't know, unless you can market so effectively your recycled product, right? I mean, maybe you could. Which you guys do, but for the most part, it doesn't make economic sense. I guess the real question is the government only mandates it because it supposedly makes environmental sense. But if it's not even making environmental sense, now I'm really confused.
Just think of if I want to get 1 million pounds of raw material to make my gidget, whatever it is I'm making, and that 1 million pounds can come out of the ground, single pipe that'll go into my plant, and I start processing it. Think how efficient that is. Or 1 million pounds where I've got to go buy tens of thousands of homes individually, pick it up, labor intensive, throw it in a truck, drive that truck around, take it out, resort it, very manual, again, resorting out the plastic. Then I've got to grind it up. Then I've got to, and just think of that economics to get to the basic raw material versus the pipe coming out of the ground.
Right.
This literally giving me millions of pounds.
Right. In an era where we are concerned with CO2 emissions primarily as the climate change debate, that would seem to be the wrong thing to do. It would be to expend more energy. So I guess that's the thing my environmentalist friends would have to answer. Because recycling does make me feel good. I have to admit it. Like it does.
Sure.
So you mentioned gas prices and oil prices. So let's get into that, because that's a big deal for Texas right now. And you are obviously closely intertwined with the oil and gas industry. Where do you see this going? And how can we help our industry?
Well, I think that we need to look at oil and gas. It's a really bifurcated argument, because you have senators. I know it's just a debate. You have a Ted Cruz on one side, and I'm I'm not arguing politics here. You have Ted Cruz on one side saying this is millions of jobs, billions of dollars of tax revenues and so forth to the state of Texas and to the United States at large. You have other senators that are saying, why are we subsidizing oil and gas? When you look at the whole energy complex, and I probably am touching on maybe some raw nerves here, but I personally think, I'm not a conspiratorialist or anything. I think that one of the reasons why we keep such a large military presence in the Middle East is not because we're worried about the democratic stabilization of a place like Afghanistan, but it's vital to our economy. It's a raw material source. It is the engine of growth to the world. We do not live on a gold standard. We live on an oil standard. And when there's volatility in that price of oil, we've got to look at our energy is something that's strategic to us. And when we are in a position today where we are a net exporter of petroleum products and energy, forget the word petroleum for a second, energy, manufactured goods. When we are in a position today that we have not been in since the 1950s, early 1950s, and there isn't anybody working today in the workforce today that was working in the late 40s. Yeah, when we were last in this position.
It's really worrisome. Because you look at pictures of the 1970s and these long gas lines and oil price spikes, and all of a sudden your gas is super expensive, and that's a result of us not controlling any of it.
That's right.
Which is, I would agree with that foreign policy analysis up to a point. I think there's you can make that case to a large extent. In the first Gulf War, I do think we tend to be obsessed with the Middle East these days, mostly because of terrorist threats. But I'm just hair splitting there. But that's absolutely right. You can imagine if we do lose our energy independence, you can imagine our foreign policy having to really ramp up and to be oil centric again. And this is a huge problem. I'm obviously on Ted Cruz's side on this one,
as am I.
But as most Texans or anybody who represents any district in Texas has to be, and unfortunately that's not the case. Just so everybody knows, it's kind of mind blowing. Doesn't matter that your constituents work there. Doesn't matter that their livelihoods are based off the oil and gas industry. And here's why this is so infuriating to me. If the argument is that, well, we got to save our planet and let the oil and gas industry die, well then you need to think a few layers deeper, right? Because there's energy demand is going to go up. I've read. And I think these are accurate predictions, 20 to 25% the next 20 years. So who's going to provide that energy? If it's not the U.S., it's going to be Russia, Saudi Arabia. Our own EPA does studies on this, suggest that the life cycle of natural gas coming from Russia is 42% higher carbon emissions than that of coming from the United States. So our friends up in Boston would rather import on a big ship, which I'm pretty sure isn't solar, right? That's a ship that runs on diesel last time I checked, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean into that harbor to provide them natural gas to heat their homes. And they would rather do that. Not only that, but Democrats just yesterday proposed that we ban all new pipeline production, gas pipeline production in the United States. They hate American energy so much that they would rather import Russian natural gas and let them take over our energy production. Obviously, I'm just ranting at this point, but I can't imagine a worse, more short-sighted policy. It's crazy.
Yeah, they ought to live by their own principles then.
Yeah,
and go without natural gas. Live in a home without natural gas, because if you're not going to use natural gas, you have to use fuel oil. So you have black, heavy oil, and which is going to be multiple times worse, less efficient, less effective. You're having a truck again come house by house, deliver it. Incredibly environmentally destructive. Well, now we can say, well, let's go to wind and let's go to solar, which again, I'm all for that, but we've invested billions. And by the way, I'm all for it in part because we produce the wind blades, we produce the solar panels. That's all from plastic, by the way.
Yeah.
You can't have any of that industry in wind, solar, batteries, and so forth.
Right.
You just look at the carbon footprint to produce a battery going into a Tesla. Which I think are wonderful cars. I'm a huge admirer of what they're
super cool.
But
I want one.
But you look at that battery, and that battery's taking more CO2 to produce that battery than the average car. Again, the fuel effective internal combustion car is going to use in the first 50,000 miles of driving.
Wow.
So think about it, before the Tesla even leaves the lot, and what's powering I saw a bumper sticker here, and only in Houston would you see this on a Tesla. Built by oil, powered by coal, subsidized by the taxpayer. That was on the back of a Tesla, and I wanted to buy a Tesla just to put that on the back of it.
Yeah, that's funny.
Do you think about that? But
I like the self-awareness of that Tesla owner. He's like, hey, I like my Tesla, but yeah. I know what I'm buying.
I know what I'm buying. But no, you actually look at it, and you look at it, and I agree with your points on the Middle East. There is a lot of religious fundamentalism over there that is 9/11 amply. 9/11 was not about oil. Let's be honest. What funds a lot of these groups is what worries me. A lot of these supposed charities and so forth, and Sunni Shia and so forth. And then it comes from oil. And so my point more than anything else is if you're going to be funding that area, you can't control where that money goes. Yeah. And more and more, you look at who's going to be dependent on that Strait of Hormuz, that bottleneck for oil coming in and out. It's going to be China. That's a whole nother. Yeah. It's not going to be us anymore. That's my point. If we really want to look at this from a strategic, a national point of view, a security point of view, energy, I think, is as important as anything next to second in place to our democracy.
This is why I talk about the environmental side so much, because I know that's what my colleagues on the left care about. But they're blinded by it, right? It's the only question they have. Well, the environment. I'm like, fine, let's actually look into what's good for the environment. Let's look at this strategically. This is why I bring up the Russian imports into Boston, because I have a feeling, and Boston doesn't have. They might have like 5 or 6 Republicans walking around, maybe. And I bet if I pulled everybody I knew, because I lived in Cambridge, I did all my schooling in Boston. I have a feeling that if I asked them a simple question, would you rather heat your home with Russian natural gas, which burns 42% more over the life cycle, more carbon emissions, or American natural gas? Choose. I would think that they would say, oh, I would choose American natural gas. Well, then how is it that your policymakers are making such radically different decisions and so openly? Why don't people know this? Why aren't we getting this information to them effectively? And that's on me. That's a rhetorical question because that's my job. That's why I do this. That's why I just said it on the podcast so that people know. And we have to be talking about these things. We have to be pointing out that, listen, I know it makes you feel good to make that Tesla. The Tesla's really cool. I don't want to ban Teslas at all. I think they're awesome. But let's at least be honest with ourselves about what's causing environmental harm and what isn't. Is it the plastic straw that's getting into that turtle's nostril? An American plastic straw? No, it's really not. That big plastic garbage patch in the middle of the ocean, is that really American plastic? Like, no, it's not. Guys, like let's focus our efforts. Like notice that our conversation, by the way, has continued to wrap around one entity, whether it's plastic waste, whether it's foreign policy, or because you just mentioned China and their desire to meddle in the Middle East. So maybe this is a good stepping off point to get on to China. And from you're a multinational company. I think there's a lot of political will right now to somehow make China pay. I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that they hid a lot of they hid the truth about this virus. They let it spread deliberately. And the next question is, from a technical standpoint, what do we do about it? How do we bring our supply chains home? How do we become more competitive, et cetera? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, first of all, let me just say that I'm not a China basher and I'm not anti-China. I went to China for the very first time. My father took me there. Like I said, he was involved with the Nixon administration, worked with Kissinger, and worked in part with opening some of those doors that I think are so vital. Went to China for the first time in 1978. My brother has been the U.S. ambassador to China. We do $1 billion of business in China.
Which is why you're actually a perfect person to ask, because it's one thing to ask somebody who's just like, oh, just tear them all down, but there's clearly American interests that go back and forth, and we have to be very careful with our policy making going forward.
There is, and one big reason for that is that China buys a lot of our debt.
Yeah.
And you want to become independent from China? People say, well, buy America first. No, that's really not the issue. The issue is how much debt, who's going to pay for all these $1 trillion stimulus programs? Somebody's got to buy that debt. We print more dollars, and that's just going to cause hyperinflation eventually. The bill's going to come due. Or somebody else buys that debt. And right now, among the biggest buyers in the market are the Chinese.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if the Chinese...
biggest foreign buyers.
That's right, the biggest foreign buyers. That's right.
Yeah. Some people, I think, wrongly believe that China owns most of our debt, which isn't
most of it's
not true.
in our own savings and pension plans in the United States. But from a foreign buyer perspective, so look, we're much better off having an open and a realistic dialogue and trade with China. Now, I emphasize the words open, and it's. I do not believe that we have free trade. I think we ought to be emphasizing fair trade.
Right.
And you look at NAFTA. NAFTA was a 30-year-old agreement that didn't talk about environmental issues. It didn't talk about human rights. It didn't talk about currency manipulation. It didn't talk. I can go on and on and on. We these trade agreements, and this is one area where I maybe don't agree with President Trump in the way he's handling the negotiations, but I do support him that we need to be looking at these agreements ought to be evergreen. We ought to continuously be looking. And our trade with China is, I think, what keeps our nations relevant, and it keeps them talking to each other. And this is a good thing. In the last decade, we've lifted more people by American ideas and ideals going around the world. And the China I visited in 1978, everybody wore a cap with a red star on it. Everybody wore Mao's jacket. Everybody wore the same shoes, same pants, and everything. And the China I go to today is completely covered and infiltrated with American brands, American logo, American industry, American trade, and American technology. Some of that purposely, a big chunk of it stolen. Be the first to admit that. But we American ideas and ideals have won over the last decades. You don't see Chinese Politburo communism and brands and flags and so forth coming into the United States.
Yeah, it's not as overt as maybe it was in the 70s, but it does seem like President Xi has tried to reverse this trend this good trend that you're talking about. And when I speak to a lot of experts on China, that seems to be the case, because I mean they still have 1 million people in the concentration camps, and they're still a totalitarian society to a huge extent. And and I don't think anybody's saying, okay, it's time to just cut off all business ties with China. That would be suicide for us as well. I guess the question is, how do we make it more fair? How do we prevent this intellectual property theft? How do we incentivize our companies to make more stuff here, especially things like we're knowing we need now? Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal published another article that China is limiting exports for the PPE that we need because 3M has manufacturing there, and we're out of luck. We can blame you hear that, media? You can blame the president all you want. There is no magic snap of your fingers that just creates more N95 masks. You need a manufacturing facility to do that. And Trump is the only one who's been saying to bring manufacturing home, to his credit. And so, how do we, we can say that all we want as politicians, that we want to bring some of these supply chains home, incentivize businesses to do more here. What does that look like in practice? What would make sense?
Well, the first, again, is the realization that a lot of, if we bring that manufacturing home, the reason why a lot of it went to China, corporations didn't go to China because they're trying to build diplomatic relationships. And they went there because they made money, and we brought back a cheaper product that could sell to a wider market.
Right.
You walk through a Tiffany's diamond store, and you're not going to find anything made in China. You walk through a Walmart, and you're going to find piles of goods made in China. So, and I'm not trying to have class warfare here, but we have a much wider range of products, particularly those on the lower end of the income scale can afford, can buy, and things that used to be real luxuries to us are now far more affordable because we've been able to exploit the cheap labor of China. Now, China, and their zest to catch up to the United States, obviously, and very openly, has stolen technology, stolen labor, and let's remember, they are far more dependent on the United States than we are on China. Yeah, and so this is, and
the tariff wars demonstrated that.
It is absolutely. You go back to the beginning of that tariff war, read any headline, and it was within a week we'll be on our knees. The Chinese will force us to do this. The Chinese can, they have this ability because they're a totalitarian state to endure pain much longer than us. We've got an economy where about 13% of our entire economy is built on exports. Chinese are at 32%. And half of that export that the U.S. GDP is made up of is Canada and Mexico, which I know this is going to sound like the ugly American. From an economic point of view, Canada and Mexico is really our 1st and 51st and 52nd state from an economic point of view.
Yeah.
I mean, it's cheaper to bring in food and energy from Western Canada into the United States than it is to ship it to Eastern Canada.
Right.
And so, I mean, we just look at some of these things. The largest exporting market we have for natural gas is going to Mexico, which is in ways great for us, bad for them because they've got a lot of natural gas because their energy industry is so screwed up. Take note, government run.
Yeah.
You know,
it's
one of the least efficient, similar to Russia, which brings back an interesting point on our regulatory environment in the United States. You were saying that Russian gas emits 42% more
over the life
CO2.
cycle. Yeah, because of their operations, because of their pipelines, and so it's a number of
That's
things.
That's right, and because it's poorly regulated, and and they don't have the economic incentive to build a pipeline system that's effective, and so it's leaking all over the place. Okay, I don't want somebody to listen to that and think, well, you're just anti-Russian gas. It has nothing to do with where the gas
it's
comes
not
from.
the actual gas. It's how they use it, how they produce it. There's a whole lot of factors that go into it. Yeah.
So I mean, but China is I continue to just believe, having been in Russia, traveling throughout the Soviet Union when it was collapsing. I was in Armenia when Armenia and Azerbaijan went to war over Nagorno-Karabakh and saw people running through the streets firing AK-47s in the air and so forth. And I think China looks at that and says, well, that's not going to happen here. But I'm a fundamental believer that there are more people today that live under some form of self-determination than at any time in the history of the world. We have greater peace, greater prosperity, greater opportunities for education, for women's rights, healthcare. Even with this plague going through the global environment, we still live healthier today than we ever. Our parents and our grandparents couldn't have dreamed of a utopian society we have today.
Well, that's true.
Yet we sit here and we whine and complain about the whole thing. You know, the times have never been worse, and we can look about China. My point about China is just this arc from 1978 to today. Yeah, I'm very concerned about some of the steps that they're taking as a government, and I think that they're trying to reverse it. Why are they trying to reverse it? I think they're trying to reverse it because they see more and more of the society moving to openness, moving to what we have. The young people want what we have.
Yeah.
And that's a threat to totalitarian societies. It
is. I mean, in their Belt and Road Initiative, these are the things that President Xi has really started to put forth to be a huge adversary to us economically. And I think that translates in the next decade or so to a military adversarial relationship as well. I think they're waiting to get there. Right now, they're focused on the economic adversarial relationship. You know, Made in China 2025, the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, what this tells us policymakers and what we worry about is that basically we were hoping that China, as we included them into the global system, that they would act like a responsible part of that global system. And it seems like they're always trying to cheat the global system and then pretend to be the victim. And it's just got to stop.
But when that's up to our policymakers, and frankly, I think they're doing a very poor job of holding them accountable. So what can we do
better?
I think we need to hold them accountable when they come to these forums that we invite them to and so forth. We need to be able to call them out, and understand that this is more than just a relationship over cheap goods that are going into our stores and so forth. And from that standpoint, again, I don't necessarily like. I think Trump can be a real bull in the China shop, but every president since Nixon that has been elected on the platform, I'm going to get in the office, I'm going to be tough with China. Mm-hmm. Whether you like Trump or not, he's the first one that's actually done it. And every president, and it was Obama said the same thing, Clinton said the same thing, Carter said the same thing, Democrat, Republican, they're all going to get tough with China. And they don't.
So what? I've done a few episodes already on the policies to make China pay. So I won't go down that road just yet. Well, I don't think I've said this yet. We are dropping a bill this week that would prevent officials from China stepping foot in the United Nations if they were involved in the propaganda to cover up the coronavirus. So, even though that's just a diplomatic way to do it, it's at least sending a message. I want to ask you about what Japan did recently. I think they just announced a policy that would, and I might screw up the details here, but I believe gives businesses credit for bringing their manufacturing back to Japan away from China. Have been following that, and what do you think about it?
I've not really been following that. Japan is one of the most Actually, it's far harder to do business in Japan than it is to China.
Oh, really?
If you want to go to Japan and set something up in Japan, the regulations, the red tape and everything, the inability to really have an expatriate community there and so forth. China has a lot of faults, but if you were to just go to produce some gadget or something, you do it in China because it's that much easier to do business there.
And I guess I wanted to expand on the point you were making, which I think we all understand. The reason that manufacturing ended up in China in the first place, it's cheaper labor, it's easy to do, and
cheap labor.
And so, but again, if the goal of the United States is to bring at least some of these supply chains and manufacturing back to the United States, then what is the right policy to do that doesn't hurt that doesn't also, cut off our own nose? Is it the tax credits like Japan is doing, or what else is it? Is it the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we already passed have a big part to play in that already, or what? How can we do this better?
Well, I think that the federal government, can certainly do a job and a task in creating an environment where business can flourish. But I'm going to explain something and try to do it in 10 or 15 seconds that the news cycle can't, because it's simply just too complicated. We need to look at the life cycle, whether it's a barrel of oil going to pharmaceutical products, and understand what regulations and so forth. We understand that when we have a supply chain that is routed through China or routed through Russia or routed through something else, I think we're going to come out of this whole Corona experience and say, just a minute, our biotech products, we don't want to go to China anymore. Matter of fact, we don't want to go to any country anymore. We're going to look at that as a strategic. Our PPE equipment, we don't want that to go to a third country. But we've got to understand, we're going to be paying more for that.
Yeah.
And if that's worth it, again, we need to think back on times like now when we couldn't get the PPE equipment because it's sitting in China under red tape, under communist red tape. We need to be ready to say, well, that's the price we're willing to pay.
Right.
And if we're willing to pay that, and if we're willing to look at our energy sector, and we're willing to say, not that oil needs to necessarily be a strategic product, but we ought to say to our economy, this is worth 10, 15 million jobs. This is worth 13% of our GDP.
Right.
Do we understand what that means to the consumer up in Boston?
Yeah, it gets to a debate that's happening on the conservative side of the aisle, between a more libertarian line of thought and a line of thought that would say, hey, there is value in some kind of industrial policy sometimes. Now, how that plays out is, anybody's guess. And libertarians would say, well, now you're picking winners and losers. You can't do that. But somebody like, I guess I've had Orrin Cass on my show before, and he pushes for this industrial policy mindset. And, he points out really what we're talking about here. Yeah, you're going to have a few cents extra cost per unit, but it's made here. And it means manufacturing jobs are here. And it means that we're energy independent. It's like the debate between the Jones Act, the anti-Jones actors, and the Jones Act, pro-Jones Act, and I can see both sides. I mean, I really can. But I see a ton of value in the fact that we have an industry of mariners who are American. And that matters for our national security. And these are good jobs. They don't need this. They don't need a 4-year degree. They're making a lot of money. There's value to that. And we have to balance that. And does it cost us more to move some sugar around? Yeah, it sure does. But maybe that's worth it. And I think we just have to be honest about that debate.
Let's remember too that a barrel of oil from the Middle East, I'm not trying to pick on the Middle East, but it's a barrel of oil at $10 if it's costing us that versus a barrel of oil in the U.S. that's $10. Libertarian might say, well, it doesn't matter which they're both $10 a barrel, so it doesn't matter which one you buy. But if we're taking and spending X billions of dollars a year to protect the Strait of Hormuz so that there can be free shipping over there, that maybe is more like $15 a barrel. And if we're having to pay our out-of-work oil workers over here unemployment insurance and so forth, okay, maybe that's $17 a barrel now.
Right.
And that price of oil, and that's why I say it's complicated, but we need to understand what it takes when we think about those supply chains. And typically, this is a common rule in business, the shorter your supply chain and the simpler your supply chain, the more profitable and the easier and the cheaper it's going to be.
So from a policy perspective, now I'm digging into real details, trying to get answers out of you. if I wanted to write a law that would have that outcome of bringing that supply chain closer to home, knowing full well that those N95 masks will now cost slightly more than they did before, what is the best way to do that? Is it through tax credits? Do we just pass a law that says this percentage has to be manufactured in the U.S.? You figure it out. From a business owner's perspective, what is the lightest touch from government that would be the most efficient way to do something like that?
Probably to take down the barriers, taxes, and so forth. I hate to use the word tariffs, but I mean, if we're educated and we're strategic as a economy, should we be exporting a barrel of oil hypothetically to China, where they're going to take it and produce the components and the parts to go into an airplane? They then sell us the airplane, or should we keep the barrel of oil here in North America and look at that as something that we're willing to pay a little bit more for that barrel of oil? And we're willing to have the jobs that are associated, because that barrel of oil is going to take 2 or 3 jobs to build it. But by the time that barrel of oil gets into an airplane, it's going to be hundreds of jobs and taxes. And these are manufacturing jobs, something that Europe has written off and lost, something that we're on the brink of. If it wasn't for a competitive environment that we have around the energy industry, we'd be doing the same thing here.
Yeah.
You want to make $70,000-$80,000 a year? You know, I can't say right now this very hour, but 2 months ago, go to a trade tech for 6 to 12 months, learn how to weld, get a truck, put a welder on the back of it, and go work in the oil, gas, chemical industry. And you look at the plumbers, the electricians, and the pipe fitters. I know because I pay them, and our company pays for these services, and they're short. We you know, if the biggest problem we've got is retaining workers.
Yeah.
That do this for 2 or 3 years, and they find out that this just isn't fun. And I can collect more on uninsurance or some unemployment insurance.
Yeah.
But we've got a real manufacturing effort in this company. I started my career in this company as a truck driver.
Really?
That used to be a really cool position to go into. And it's no longer that way. It's hard. It's tough, especially when it's 30 below zero and you're going across Wyoming. Yeah. But yeah, it's work.
There's value to be had in hard labor. You know, I say that often. I'm glad my dad made me work a couple summers on a Texas ranch just outside San Antonio. Just all I did was move around rocks. I'm not really sure how useful I was, but it was hard. And you build character with that kind of toughness.
Well, you also learn working with those rocks are probably preparing you to work with some of the people you work with.
Oh, nice. Yeah, this is true. So you mentioned all of the electricians and plumbers, pipe welders. A lot of them work for you. You know, how can we talk about that more? How can we get more high school students to understand that there's more options than just that 4-year degree, and you know, that there's a real need in some of these trade jobs that pay really well? And again, you can always go get that 4-year degree at some other point in your life, but there's a stigma around that. I mean, and so how can corporations help with that? And maybe it's through apprenticeship programs, maybe it's through encouraging trade schools. I don't know. I mean, what is government's role in all that?
Well, I think that we have a misperception in society that if you don't have a college degree, you're going to be poor.
You don't have a college degree, you mentioned.
Well, I'll be the very first to admit I've had a number of doors from a very generous father and so forth that were open to me. I would not encourage you, if you want to become a chief executive officer, to drop out of college. That's not. I've never said that. I was my father.
It's a family company.
It's a family company, and I've been incredibly blessed. But I look at our businesses in East Texas, the Beaumont area. We're so short of workers and chemical workers. Again, these are $70,000 to $100,000 a year jobs with benefits and retirement and everything thrown in there. And then people work 30 years now. They're going to retire as a millionaire in with their savings and pensions over if they save during that time period. We will, as a company, if you want to go to do a 6-month or 9-month apprenticeship or something, Exxon will pay for it.
Yeah.
Huntsman will pay for it. You go do it, and then you come work for us. And we're not going to garnish your wages or anything. Just come work
investment.
for us.
Yeah.
And
do you have trouble recruiting for these programs?
Yes, we do.
That's crazy.
And the highest unemployment in Texas, among the highest unemployment in Texas, is out in East Texas.
Why do you think it's so hard to recruit high school kids into these programs? I don't understand.
When I went to high school, not that I was a stellar student, far from. I worked every day in Safeway bagging groceries, and I worked in weekends restocking shelves. And even though my father had money, I had to pay for half of everything that I wanted. Eventually,
Where'd you grow up?
In Salt Lake City and also in Virginia. Okay. And I had to transition over into where eventually you're paying for all of this stuff. And it wasn't my father told me I had to go work. It was just expected. Everybody did it in those days. If you didn't have a job, you were a bum.
Well,
now you call somebody a bum.
Statistically, this is true. I mean, statistically, you look at teenagers working and teenagers in the workforce, it's dropped dramatically.
Well, it's because businesses, frankly, can't afford to hire them because we've got a minimum wage. It used to be I made $2 an hour at Safeway, and that's about what I was worth. Yeah, inflation adjusted basis, am I worth $17 today as a slack-jawed teenager putting stuff into a bag that required 8 hours of training to do this job? No, I wasn't worth that. And as a teenager with flexible hours and everything, there was something that was good about that entry level position. Right. And we took a lot of pride in that. And the idea that you had a couple bucks in your pocket and you could pay for your own gas and your 8-track tapes and a 6-pack of Paps, that meant something to people. Yeah. And I'm not sure that when you're going through that high school experience today, I'm not sure that we pride ourselves on that, because by the time you get into college, if you haven't had a real get your hands dirty sort of job, when and how do you learn to work?
It changes you to such an extent. It's so huge.
I mean, again, I grew up in a pretty nice home, but when I was working out Safeway, the other baggers, I was working with people in their 30s and 40s, veterans and so forth, that were coming home a couple of years back from Vietnam and so forth, and doing the same job I was doing. I mean, that was a real eye-opening experience for me. I was working with people that were earning a fraction of what my father earned, and I had to work with them. I had to work out with them. It was just a rich experience that affected me. Yeah, and we should be encouraging that amongst our youth. And I guess I wonder if it depends on which part of the country you're in. I feel like I do meet a lot of teenagers who work, but again, statistically, that's just not true, and it's problematic. So, aside from trying to get people great paying jobs and getting that message out, I mentioned earlier on in the podcast that Huntsman does a lot of work with cancer research and mental health. So what is the next frontier on these things, and what are you guys working on? Well, I look at again, it's not our corporation that's necessarily giving money. Our corporation's a public company, meaning anybody can go buy the stock in it. And our family is one of the largest shareholders. We've been selling off those shares over the years to fund cancer research. And so I want to be clear, I don't believe that it's necessarily the corporation's responsibility to support charities. I think it's the corporation's responsibility to be run well, pay a dividend, reward your shareholders. It's American exceptionalism and it's the American culture that then ought to turn around and do something with that money. Right. Corporations shouldn't be. We ought to be the generators of wealth. It ought to be the American people that support those philanthropies. Not that corporations don't have a role. Of course they do in some of those. Right. But my father started with a $5 million donation 22 years ago at the University of Utah to build a small cancer research. And over that I probably shouldn't use the word, but over that time, it's metastasized into $3 billion that either the family's given or that we've raised. And as I look at cancer, Dan, you had a great book in Fortitude, and I came away thinking much higher of you than I did when I started the book. But I tell you, the real hero in that book. I don't know how to take that. The real hero of that book wasn't you; it's your mother. Yeah. I mean, could you imagine going through life where you know that you've got a ticking time bomb, you're prime of your life, and you've got a ticking time bomb. There's no cure for it, and you're going to die. And it's going to be a couple years away. I mean, you and I, well, I'm probably, now that I'm in my mid-50s, but I think you feel like you're going to live forever, right? Mm-hmm. That's decades away. Yeah. Think what your mother went through every morning. She woke up and she had to think. She was my age now, or when she was first diagnosed. Yeah. Think about that. I mean, those are the real heroes of society. I mean, the people that she could have got up every morning and whined and complained. Yet in your book, you say, I was interested in everything you said about your mother, because it's this character that I see over and over again with cancer survivors and cancer, unfortunately, those that don't survive. They live every day for something that's more noble and something that's better than just themselves. And you're a legacy of that. You're a byproduct of what your mother obviously taught you.
Yeah, no, she absolutely a hero, and you do see it in cancer patients. This sort of this grit and perseverance, and it really shows the strength of the human spirit
and the prioritization.
Yeah,
I've only got so many days,
gratitude.
so I'm going to make the best of this
right.
day.
The sense of gratitude that becomes a part of that, and I hope that our society as a whole, after going through this crisis that we're going in, starts to feel a little bit more perspective than we did before. But we shall see. I think if everybody turns off the TV, I think we'll be good.
You know, we also need to make sure that we're looking at I was looking this morning. I'm on the board of Memorial Hermann, which is one of the largest healthcare chains here in the Houston area. You know, per 100,000 people in the Houston area, we have one death per 100,000. New York City is 64 deaths.
Yeah.
New York City is not 64%, 64 times greater,
right.
deadlier. Why then are we under the same sort of?
Oh, well, you want to get me
restrictions?
started on this? You want to get me started?
To a second hour here, but you know, it's insanity to see with Memorial Hermann, great hospital chain here. We're running at 30, 40%. We've got nurses, we've got doctors that have no work.
Well, yeah.
our ventilators we've got hundreds and hundreds of them that are, and this whole thing about flattening the curve, our curve's really flat.
It never increased really. I mean, okay, well now I'm going to get started on this. Here's the thought experiment that everybody in America needs to do. Okay, as we go forward. If your numbers are like Houston's and we have 29 total deaths and, you know, I think a few thousand total cases, most of which have already recovered. Okay, these aren't like a few thousand people in the hospital, mind you. Our hospitalizations are going down. But technically speaking, there's another case per day, right? So the curve is still going up. It's not, you know, it's not going down. It's kind of flat, but it's not down. So if we follow this logic that it has to be going down for 14 days before we even think about reopening, let's ask ourselves if that makes sense. And this is how to do it. This is the thought experiment that everybody needs to do for their own city. If you took your numbers and you erased the word Houston and you wrote the word New York City, what would that mean? It would mean that New York City would open. They would be celebrating in the streets. Everybody would be shaking, maybe not shaking hands yet, but they'd be happy, and they would consider themselves on such an enormous downtrend in cases that they could really start opening up society and getting back to normal. So let's ask ourselves a question. How is it that the same exact data for two major cities can mean two totally different policy outcomes? That simple thought experiment is proof that we are not thinking about this correctly. I mean, the curve is a data point for sure, but the absolute values in that curve matter a great deal as that compares to our healthcare capacity. As you mentioned, we're like 30% capacity in Memorial, and the other hospitals are similar. So I keep saying this publicly over and over and over again. We need to think in a more sophisticated way. You know, it's like we lost all critical thinking skills in America over the last couple months.
We do, and we have. And I mean, you just look at the Center for Disease Control this last winter that just ended technically 2 weeks ago, the flu season. Mm-hmm. We lost somewhere, according to the Center for Disease Control, somewhere between 40 and 65,000 American lives this last winter. I don't remember a single news story.
Right.
The winter before that, 35,000. The winter before that was somewhere between 65 and 85,000.
Yeah.
150% of all the casualties in 30 years in Vietnam. One winter, 2 years ago. I don't remember one story, one closure, one even a caution.
It's because we're used to it. It's because we're used to that risk, and this is a new risk.
We have a vaccine
it's different. It is different.
Like I don't want
the
vaccine.
Right.
It is different. It's a more aggressive virus we have today, but.
Yeah, we need perspective in our lives, and I just want us to interpret the data correctly. And I don't really have a problem with the lockdowns. I think they were necessary. I call them sort of a tactical retreat that needed to happen just to make sure that spikes didn't occur. But I'm not hearing a sophisticated critical analysis of how to get out of that. I'm hearing safetyism at all costs, and that's not the right way to look at things. I'm just going to keep saying it because it's true. Like we have to take risk mitigation measures that are reasonable alongside opening our society. We just do. And I think we can. I keep passing all these empty stores, and I'm trying to logically think through, what is the difference between this store and the grocery store? What is the difference between this dry cleaner and the grocery store, except that the dry cleaner is way less crowded on any given day and probably less dangerous than going to the grocery store. So how does it therefore mean that we should be closing this one but not this one? Obviously, we can't close grocery stores because that would be a disaster, and that's why they're open. But again, if that's our logic, then why not start opening up these stores as well? Especially in a place, again, if you're in New York City, you got a different situation. I understand what they're doing. But here in Houston, we just don't have the cases. We just don't.
Huntsman today is considered categorized as a critical industry.
Mm-hmm.
Go talk to my barber, Lisa, who owns Lisa Barbers in the Woodlands,
Yeah.
and ask her if her shop is a critical industry.
It is, because my hair is horrible right now.
Well,
and I would love to go pay Lisa a bunch of money to cut my hair.
But to her and the 3 barbers who work there, it's their livelihood. Of course it's critical.
Right.
What the hell are we doing saying that hers isn't a critical dollar, but somehow mine is a critical dollar? I don't get it.
The more, and just like any risk, the more you learn about it, the more you learn how to mitigate it. And we've gotten to this point in modern history, and it's a great point in modern history, where we have removed all hardship from our lives to an extraordinary extent. I mean, not to say that people don't still experience hardship, but comparatively speaking, in historical terms, that hardship it's not comparable at all. I mean, it's quite nice to be in modern times, but as a result, we are more easily scared by any kind of challenge, and we need to rise above it. I mean, that is the American way, to rise above it and to take personal responsibility as you move out into society, which by the way, I think most Americans are right now. I think most Americans intrinsically believe this, that like, listen, I know what tools I need to implement to stay safe out there and get back to work. If we're wearing masks from now on, we're wearing masks from now on until there's a vaccine. That seems reasonable. If we're not touching each other or not shaking any hands until there's a vaccine, that seems perfectly reasonable. There's no need to shake hands. That seems fine. If we need to somehow change some of the layouts in the office, maybe that's what we do, but there's ways to adapt. If restaurants just have less seating where we're not crowding everybody into, tables next to each other anymore, then that's the new normal, just for a while at least. But let's open some of these smaller stores. Doesn't mean we're having a giant rock concert next week, that maybe those kind of big events are pushed back even further. But what really troubles me is the moral grandstanding that occurs when you try to have these really normal and logical conversations that you just don't care about people's lives. And that's just such a disingenuous argument. It just drives me crazy.
Dan, it's just one last thought. Go back 100 years ago. Just exactly, your grandparents were alive. This isn't thousands of years ago. There were 3 things that were on the mind of every single American. We just concluded a war that had taken 100,000 American lives and taken millions of lives around the world, 8 to 10 million lives around the world. We just gotten out of a plague that had taken some 50 million lives around the world. We have no idea, because in China and India, we have no idea how many people died in the Spanish influenza during that time period. And excuse me to the Spaniards, no, they didn't cause the influenza.
Don't worry.
And you look at the third thing that our parents worried about was starvation. We had millions of people every year that died of starvation around the world. Again, we didn't even track it. It was so nebulous, and human life was just, it wasn't even a statistic then. That's only 100 years ago. Now today we have more people that die of overeating than undereating.
No, yeah,
we have more people that die of suicide than die of war.
Right, an indication of low income is other health problems that are not related to starving.
That's right. And, so, and you look at those 3 maladies from 100 years ago. They've all been turned on their head. We, society, we're doing okay. We're doing well. We're doing well environmentally, economically. Sometimes we need to step back. And this American exceptionalism globally, in my opinion, that's been the catalyst for that. We need to step back from time to time.